I was going to do this video on the weekend, but I got really caught up and busy with stuff, so I'm just going to do it now. There was a retirement that happened over the weekend or late last week that may have gone under your nose if you aren't following the independent wrestling scene or if you don't know this person. But I wanted to talk about the retirement of Homicide from the professional wrestling business because I have a lot of history when it comes to Homicide and my personal wrestling fandom. The first independent wrestling show I ever went to live in my life was 20 years ago in 2004, and Homicide was the main eventer. He main evented that show against Dan Moff. CM Punk was also on that show. He was the co-main eventer. And so since then, I started to get into independent wrestling, starting with Ring of Honor, and then thanks to the internet, learning about companies like Border City Wrestling, Jersey All Pro Wrestling, 3PW, 1PW. A lot of these companies don't even exist anymore, or at least I haven't heard from them in a long time. But there was a time in the mid 2000s when DVDs became very inexpensive to author, where you had these indie companies relying on the DVD, I guess the DVD formula to make income. They would record their shows on, with cheap cameras. And when I say cheap, I don't mean like bad. I mean like they weren't, the sports cameras that like WWE had. They were just handhelds, but they were good enough. And then they would put their stuff on DVD, and this opened up the wrestling world to seeing wrestlers and matches and match types that they had never seen before. I mean, a good example of that would be CZW, Combat Zone Wrestling, which started doing the ultra violent stuff, and that was the first time I ever saw guys like Eddie Kingston. Kevin Owens, when he was Kevin Steen, really made a name for himself there. And when I say Kevin Owens, I also think about PWG, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. During this whole time, Homicide was right there in the thick of things and quickly became one of the most sought after indie talents. Homicide was not only known to be a great wrestler and a great wrestling trainer, but a great character as well, especially when he had his heel turn in 2004 at the ROH Reborn show. I think it was Reborn, when he turned on Samoa Joe by lighting his face with fire after earlier in the match he had Joe what he thought was a 3 count and it wasn't, and then he got frustrated. So since then, Homicide has been a staple of the independents. And then came, of course, his run in TNA with the Latin American Exchange, which was, there were different versions of it, but the one that I think was the most beloved was Sean Hernandez Homicide with Conan being the mouthpiece. And I started going to TNA shows, TNA pay-per-views, when this version of LAX was the predominant tag team in the company. And because Florida had a lot of Latinos, still does, and a lot of Latino wrestling fans, the LAX were pushed as heels, but were beloved. And of course, Homicide being there was a big reason. I mean, he was a great wrestler, great character, as I mentioned, and people love the LAX. I very much remember going to a pay-per-view where they had won a match, and then Jim Cornette came out to reverse the decision, and the crowd booed Jim Cornette. Now, the reason as to why that happened was obviously like some BS, but it just showed, because LAX were heels at the time, that the crowd just loved LAX. I mean, you had a Puerto Rican, a Mexican, and a Cuban together, and a lot of the promos that were cut resonated with the Latin Americans. And I love LAX. I just truly love LAX. And then since then, I always kind of wanted Homicide to get a shot at the big leagues, and meaning WWE. But it never really happened for him. It never really happened for him. He never got to be in WWE, and I kind of suspect that he wouldn't, only because of the fact that he's not a very big guy. You know, he's not a, I wouldn't call him a small man, but he's not the kind of guy that Vince McMahon would have pushed. You know what I mean? But there were times when guys like Daniel Bryan were pushed. This would have been even before then. This is like years before then. So Homicide made appearances for, you know, TNA for a while. He was there for a while on and off. He did ROH. He worked on some independents in the Northeast, in the Chicago area. He was also on Billy Corgan's NWA Power. And I just kind of thought he would always be there. But when Triple H took over NXT, I really thought that he would eventually get an opportunity, but he didn't. Maybe because by that point he was older. I'm not really sure. Now, I want to say that the greatest storyline that I ever saw Homicide involved in, and if you haven't seen this, I would suggest seeking it out, although you may have to go on the deeper parts of the internet to get it because a lot of these DVDs are out of print. But the best storyline he was involved in was his 2006 quest to become a champion in Ring of Honor. He basically was tired, and he had a great feud with Steve Corino. That's another one that was crazy, where he actually popped Corino's eardrum and I think deafened him in one ear. And so the storyline was that Homicide said that if he doesn't win a title by the end of 2006, and at the time ROH only had 3 titles, that he would retire from wrestling. He would leave. And what happened is there was an interpromotional feud between ROH and CZW. And Homicide didn't want to get involved until they blew it off in this big War Games type of match called Cage of Death. And then Homicide showed up there as a surprise entrant. He passed out forks to everybody because Homicide was doing the Abdul the Butcher gimmick where he would use forks to stab people in the head and basically save the company. Save the company. And ROH won Cage of Death. Jim Cornette comes out and he says, okay, Homicide, you saved ROH. I'm going to give you 3 things that you want. Homicide said basically he wants a match with Steve Corino, one last match. Cornette was like, okay, I can probably do that. Then he said that he wanted a shot at the title. Okay, we can do that too. And then the last thing he wanted was for Low Ki to get reinstated. Homicide and Low Ki together had been a team for quite some time. They were real life friends. I think Homicide trained Low Ki, both from Brooklyn, New York. You know, they were together for a long time. And there was a lot of behind the scenes issues with Low Ki that I'm not going to get into here. There's lots of different stories that come out about it. It's a long story, but that transcended into kayfabe. And so Cornette's like, I can't do that for you. And then Homicide got pissed off because he's like, you told me I could have anything I wanted. And this led to the Briscoes turning heel and attacking Homicide, which would lead to Samoa Joe eventually teaming up with him against the Briscoes. So Homicide had like multiple feuds going on because he also was feuding with Corino, even though Corino wasn't around all that much until that match. So then it all came down to ROH's big final show of the year, Final Battle 2006, where it was him against Bryan Danielson for the ROH World title. And during the whole year, Bryan had been beating people with a small package. And they had been hammering home that nobody can kick out of his small package. That's right. In 2006, in the year of our Lord, 2006, Ring of Honor got an inside cradle, a small package, over as a move that you couldn't kick out of. And the smartest wrestling fans in the world, as they say, believed in it, believed in that story. It was great. And it was a great story because you would believe that somebody as scientifically proficient as Bryan Danielson could make the move better. In the match, Bryan Danielson does it. Homicide kicks out, which was the big shocker. Bryan gets up shocked. Homicide comes off the ropes and hits the big lariat because he would take off his elbow pad and hit this unprotected lariat. And it was one of his finishers. It was also the move that messed up Carino's hearing. Bam. 1, 2, 3. Homicide wins the title. And it was a big moment for the company. And a big moment. Probably the peak. That was probably the peak of Homicide's career, I would say. At least, you know, maybe not money-wise, but certainly when it came to... He was on top of the independents for that time. And he wasn't on top for very long. His title reign was only a couple months. And years later, Gabe Sapolsky would come out and say that the reason as to why is that Homicide was like Ricky Steamboat, where the chase for the title was more important than him actually being the champion. So, and that makes sense. There are some guys that are better at chasing than they are being the champion. So he winds up losing it just a couple months later. But the road to the title was a very good storyline that the fans were invested in. There were lots of twists and turns. I gave you the summary. This thing went on for almost the whole year. And it was really, really good. So Homicide is now retired. And I just wanted to say that I'm happy that he's doing good. I hope that he's got good money. He's got funds to take care of himself and his family going forward. And I genuinely hope that his retirement goes well and that he doesn't just come back. And I mean, if he has to come back, he can come back. But I mean, I hope it's not one of those wrestling retirements where he comes back in a couple years. I'm going to look positive on it, though, and be optimistic and just say, yeah, he worked hard. And I really wish he was a part of that 2016, well, 2014 to 2020 NXT, because that was the peak of NXT. So that's it. Those are my thoughts. Have a good one. See you guys later. I think I'll be talking about Raw tonight, so stay tuned for that. Have a good one.